Welcome to the Animal Training Fundamentals Podcast, where we have fun with practical application and we get mental with the science of behavior. Put them both together and you get results, solutions for your behavior problems, and the tools you need to achieve your training goals. I'm your host, Barbara Heidenreich. Let's talk training. Hey, animal lovers, it's Barbara Heidenreich back with another podcast for you. I think I've got a really fascinating topic for you this week. We're going to talk about fluency. Now, a lot of us have heard that word before, and it seems rather intuitive, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this topic. Now, when you hear the word fluency, you think, okay, yeah, that makes sense. It just means that the behavior is trained, right? But it's a little more detailed than that. Let's talk about that. So when we say fluency, we mean that the behavior is accurate. But that means we've got to look at what exactly does accuracy mean. That means we're looking at the animal is doing the behavior perfectly and it's doing it without hesitation. But that means we're measuring things. So what exactly are we measuring? Now, one of the things I have in my online education program is I have a lot of resources for you. And one of my favorites is a course that's called Identifying Behavior Goals and Documentation. And it's really all about setting up your training program, especially if you have a facility. And I have a checklist of all the things that you should go through for setting up your program. And one of the last things on the checklist is measuring your behaviors, making sure that they're fluent. When we look at a behavior, there's lots of different aspects that we can measure, and that's what we're going to look at in today's podcast. So let's look at one of the first things that we might look at if we were measuring to see if a behavior is fluent. The first thing that I might look at is response latency. And what I mean by that is when you present the cue for the behavior, does the animal actually give you a response to that cue within about 3 seconds or so? To me, that would be a criteria that would be pretty important if I was to consider the behavior fluent. And when I'm giving that cue, is the animal actually responding to the correct cue? Do I have to give the cue several times over? Because to me, that's not really a fluent behavior. I don't want to have to ask that behavior over and over and over again or present that cue over and over again. That wouldn't be something that I would consider fluent. That would be something that I would have to work on again to say that the animal actually is understanding my cue or that I trained it correctly, if that makes sense. Because what we do see sometimes is that people accidentally teach the animal that the cue is presenting the cue over and over again. I'm sure some of you have seen that before. Think about that dog that sits after you say sit 5 times instead of just saying it 1 time. That certainly does happen. Or if you're training a recall and you have to blow that whistle 6 or 7 times before the animal actually responds. So you've actually trained latency instead of training quick response to the cue. So that's something that you might want to fine tune if you're having that problem. So that means we don't actually have a fluent behavior just yet. Now, here's another one to consider. What about prompting? Now, a lot of times when we start a behavior, we do have to give the animal information to help it understand what is needed to get the action started, right? So think about using targets to get an action started. Let's say you're trying to train an animal to get on a scale. It's not going to automatically just hop on a scale. So we might do things like make a little trail of food or use a target to tell the animal which direction to go to get onto that scale. And then eventually it's going to learn that moving in that direction, getting on top of that scale is what earns it desired consequences, and you fade out that prompt of using a target or using a food lure to get the animal going in that direction. It goes, oh, there's the scale. You give it a little hand cue that tells it to go in that direction, hops on the scale, it gets the desired consequences. But eventually you're going to fade out that use of prompting to tell it where to go. You're just going to use your cue, and then the animal goes to the scale. But if you're still prompting to help that animal, give that animal information of what it needs to do, then I would say perhaps the behavior is not fluent just yet. So ask yourself, are you still using prompting to get the animal to understand what it needs to do? So that might be one of the things that you need to fade out in your training of that particular behavior. Here's another thing to consider. What about if your animal knows several different behaviors and you are giving it the cue for this particular behavior, but it gives you another behavior? It doesn't give you the behavior you asked for. And then you have to go back and give it the cue again, and then it finally gives you the correct behavior. You want the animal to give you the correct response that corresponds to the cue that you're giving 98% of the time. So if you've got an animal that is basically throwing behavior out at you, trying to guess, did I get the correct response? Then I would say the behavior's not yet fluent. And if your animal just has a small repertoire of behavior, then, it's guessing and it's probably going to get it correct, I don't know, if it's only got 2 behaviors, going to get it correct, most of the time, because just guessing between 2 behaviors. If it's got quite a few behaviors, then that percentage is going to get lower. So what you want to see is a pretty good correct response rate. So that's going to be another piece of information that lets you know whether the animal truly understands. Can it discriminate, right? That's why we call it a discriminative stimulus. Can it understand that this cue goes with this behavior? So that's another thing you can test for fluency. Now let's look at what the behavior looks like. So let's say you've trained a beautiful open mouth behavior and you want that behavior to have a nice big giant open mouth, and you want that behavior to be an open mouth that's held for a nice long duration. So there's 2 criteria that you can measure. So how wide open the mouth is and how long the animal holds the mouth open. So the duration. So you would want to measure those 2 things. I have a beautiful video I'm going to share with you on the episode page for this podcast where you can see a lovely open mouth with a bear that's been trained at Orange County Zoo, where they have a beautiful big open mouth that's held for duration. And so you can see that they've trained for specific criteria and the animal needs to meet that criteria in order to earn the reinforcers. And so that's something you can measure. If the animal's not meeting that criteria, then that behavior is not considered fluent for that particular facility. So that's something you can measure. So think about all the things that could be measured for that. And so as a team, you're going to need to agree on that criteria if you've got a number of people that are training different behaviors. So let's see some other things that you could measure. You could measure height. Let's say you have an animal that needs to go up on its hind legs for checking a particular body part. Maybe the animal has to go a specific distance. Let's say you're training flight behaviors and the animal is flying a certain distance. What about speed? Does the animal need to do the behavior with a certain amount of speed? We've already talked about duration as something you could measure. We've also got force. Maybe the animal has to press down on something with a certain amount of force. And of course, there's position. So a lot of people teach animals to present paws that might need to be in a certain position. Some animals may tendency to present that paw lower and lower and lower and lower. You might even mark something on the enclosure that says this is the height that we want that paw presented at, so we get a good look at that paw whenever we're doing a physical exam. And form, think about, again, body positioning. So let's say you're teaching an animal to present a shoulder for injections or a hip for injections. What is that exact positioning of the body that is required for that procedure to be done so that the animal can cooperate in medical care? And everyone should have the same vision of what that looks like. So if you're a team that's training animals to cooperate in medical behaviors, you all want to have a vision of what that looks like. So this is where video is really important, in my opinion, when it comes to training animals to cooperate in medical care. Photographs, share those things with each other. I also believe strongly that those records should travel with those animals when they move from different facilities so that everybody understands exactly what that looks like. Now, let's talk about another thing that's really important when we're talking about fluency. What about being able to present those behaviors in different locations? A lot of times people say, well, the animal will present that behavior at home, but it won't present it someplace else. I think about this in particular when we're talking about animals that we keep in our homes, our companion animals that we've trained to do, say, a veterinary procedure, medical behavior in our home, and now we would love that animal to present that behavior at the veterinary hospital. And now everything falls apart. Now, this can apply to our animals in our zoological settings as well, because sometimes those animals do great in their habitats at the zoological facility, and then maybe there are animals that are small enough that we transport them to the veterinary clinic, and next thing you know, they're not feeling so comfortable there, and they're less likely to present the behavior at the veterinary clinic. So again, we want to generalize the behavior so that they can be presented in different locations. So again, this might be one of those things that you would consider important to rate the behavior as fluent. Can the animal present the behavior in different locations? And when we talk about generalization, What I typically do in terms of training generalization is I practice the behavior in different locations that are relatively familiar to the animal. And that means that you're probably going to have to go back in your approximations. The behavior is not going to be perfect when you present it in a new location. So you go back in your training steps, build it back up again until it's fluent in these new environments. Usually you add one location at a time, and then it's fluent in one location. Then you add a different location. And each time that you try to train the behavior in a new location, you might have a little setback, but usually it goes faster and faster and you get back on track. And typically with generalization, what happens if you practice the behavior in many new environments, over time, the animal just goes, it's another new environment. And next thing you know, the animal is really not paying attention to the new environment at all, and the animal just does the behavior wherever you are. This is what we see a lot with animals that are trained to present behaviors in education programs. So some of you may have seen animals that will go to schools, and they've presented behaviors in so many schools now that it's just another school, and the behavior doesn't have to be retrained all over again because they've done it in so many new environments that the behavior is now generalized. They don't care that it's another new environment. They've been doing it so many times that it's just like, it's another new environment. Things that help with those situations are having familiar props, familiar trainers. The cues are very consistent. Everybody's on board with presenting the exact same cue. We've got a lot of consistency there that helps the animal be very clear on what it's supposed to do in those new environments. So everything else changes, but there's a lot of things that remain consistent that helps the animal understand what to do. Now, the same concept can be applied to people. So again, when we're talking about generalization, we can generalize the behavior to other people. So the animal is going to be able to do the behavior perfectly when a new person cues the behavior. So again, when we're talking about fluency, is the behavior fluent when other people cue the animal to do the behavior? Now, this may not be a goal for every single animal, but it may be a goal for your animal. Maybe you need this animal to do this specific behavior for a number of people that are working with this animal. So again, it might be an animal that participates in educational programming. It may be an animal that you would like the veterinary professionals at your facility can work with this animal so that veterinary care can be stress-free and that they can also perform the procedures, because maybe your veterinary professionals need to be very hands-on with the individual animals that you're working with. So if you can get the behavior so fluent that anybody can ask this animal to participate in medical care, that's going to make it so much more stress-free when it comes time to do veterinary procedures with your particular individual animal. Now, another thing that we want to consider is resiliency. And this means, what about environmental distractions? Could your animal present that behavior when there's a big environmental distraction? Now, this is a really important thing to consider, especially when we're talking about things like recall behaviors and especially emergency recall behaviors. And again, we train for this. This isn't something we just assume is going to happen. We want to prepare our animals to be resilient when there's an environmental distraction. So again, you consider this as part of your shaping plan. You're going to teach your animal to present the behavior under conditions when there are a little bit of distractions, and then you're gradually going to add more environmental distractions. Now, of course, you don't do this right in the beginning. You're going to first get all these other aspects of your behavior solid, and then you're going to gradually add those environmental distractions. Now, I've got some fun videos that I'm going to share on the episode page for this podcast. I mentioned the bear with the open mouth behavior, which is a fun one to take a look at. Another fun video I'm going to share with you is one where we were training a goat, and the goat was predicting, it was anticipating what the behavior is that she was supposed to do. So again, we can see where animals don't necessarily have the behavior on cue because they're predicting what's supposed to happen. So this is another example where behavior isn't necessarily fluent because it isn't what we would call under stimulus control. So this is where we work on teaching the animal to wait. There's a cue for wait, and then we give the cue, and the animal does the behavior on cue. So again, there is something to fluency that's important for us to look at, to measure, to assess. And as I said, I have this wonderful fluency assessment chart that's part of this course in animaltrainingfundamentals.com that you can check out when you get on the site. And as I've mentioned in the past, you can check this out for just just $1 for 10 days if you use the code TRY10days when you visit the site. Great little resource there for all of you. So this was a short one this week, but it's really a fun thing to think about, assessing fluency. Not something that a lot of us think about. We just assume animals get it. Once we've trained the behavior, it's all perfect and animals will do it on cue. But there's really a lot to think about when we're looking at fluency. You really want to flesh out the details to make sure your animal really does understand the behavior to the level that we would define as fluent. So I hope you found that little tidbit of information about animal training interesting, a little bit of a deeper dive on what I like to think about when I think about training. I did want to tell you about some fun things coming up in the next year. There is a conference in Texas called the Art and Science of Animal Training Conference that is a really fun one for me. It dives deep into the science, but we also talk about practical application. I am afraid this one is already sold out, but you can get on the waiting list. Just go to the Art and Science of Animal Training website, which if you go to barbrasfat.com, you will see, that's Barbara's Fat with 2 F's, by the way, which stands for Force-Free Animal Training. You will see a link there, so you can just go to the events page. You'll see a link there so you can find out more about that. I'm going to talk about a really fun topic there. I'm going to be talking about the constructional approach to addressing extreme fear and aggressive behavior. Really cool topic. I'm going to blow your mind. The keynote speaker there is going to be talking about negative reinforcement, which just scares everybody, doesn't it? When we think about people saying about what's humane ways of training, and you would think, oh, I would never talk about negative reinforcement. It's so awful. It's so evil. And I swear to God, I had my mind, just blown when I've had some conversations with behavior analysts about this topic. So if you can get on that waiting list, I highly recommend you get on it because it's going to blow your mind. Just expand your mind. I can't even say more about it, so check it out. And then the Animal Behavior Management Alliance Conference is going to be in the Netherlands next year. How cool is that? So if you're in Europe or if you're traveling to Europe, I highly recommend you check out this one. I'm excited to go to this one, and I've got my name on the list to try and go there. And fingers crossed I get to do a presentation there. We'll see. They haven't made their decisions yet on speakers. And I will also be speaking at the Southwest Veterinary Symposium in Fort Worth, Texas next year. Hope to be at the European Association of Zoos and Aquarium Conference. And I'll be at the Academic Animals event in the UK later in the year. And hoping to be at ZAA, which is Zoological Association of America Conference in Fort Worth, Texas, also next year. Got a bunch of travel on the calendar, so I'm going to be all over the place. I just haven't posted it all yet. But you'll keep an eye out for that, hopefully, if you go to barbrasfat.com. Oh, and I wanted to tell you there's a cool new course coming out from fearfreepets.com very soon, all about fear-free veterinary exams for birds. Yes, I was one of the authors on that. They haven't announced it yet, so just keep your eyes out for that. It'll be coming soon. Anyway, that is it for this podcast. I look forward to chatting with you soon, and we'll see you on another one down the road. Take care, everybody. Bye. If you liked what you heard today, visit animaltrainingfundamentals.com for more quality content on animal training. You'll find courses, community, and extensive video examples from my consulting work around the world. We'd love to have you join our Force-Free family.